You ever notice how people suddenly get uncomfortable when you stop behaving the way they trained you to behave? Funny, isn't it? They were perfectly happy when you were predictable, when you explained yourself, when you answered every call, accepted every excuse, swallowed every disrespect, and kept showing up just because somebody expected you to. But the second you changed, suddenly you became different. Suddenly you got an attitude. Suddenly you think you're better. No, you didn't become better than them. You just became less available for manipulation. And that scares people more than failure ever could. Because when they can't predict your reaction, they can't push the buttons they used to push. When guilt stops working, pressure stops working. When approval stops controlling you, they lose their favorite weapon. And now they're standing there wondering what happened to the version of you that used to bend every time they applied a little pressure. You didn't disappear, you woke up. You started noticing the patterns. You started hearing the words behind the words. You stopped confusing attention with love, guilt with responsibility, and somebody's disappointment with your obligation. And suddenly your silence became suspicious, your boundaries became offensive, your confidence became arrogance, and your growth became a personal attack on people who were comfortable with the old you. That's the part nobody tells you about changing. Some people don't miss you. They miss having access to the version of you they could control, predict, provoke, and manipulate. They don't hate the change because it hurt you. They hate it because it removed their leverage. And once you understand that, you stop begging people to understand your transformation and start letting them deal with the version of you they can't control. You know what's funny about people? They can tolerate almost anything about you as long as they know exactly how to control you. They can handle your ambition when it still benefits them. They can handle your confidence when it doesn't challenge them. They can even handle your success as long as they still feel like they have a little switch somewhere in the back of your mind that they can flip whenever they want. But the moment you stop reacting the way they expect, suddenly you're the problem. Suddenly you've changed. Suddenly you're acting different. Suddenly you have an attitude. That's the joke. They aren't really angry because you became someone else. They're angry because the old version of you was convenient. You explained yourself too much. You answered every question. You apologized even when you weren't wrong. You allowed people to cross lines because you were terrified of being called difficult. You gave second chances to people who treated the first one like a subscription. You kept lowering your standards just to keep certain people comfortable, and they got used to it. They started believing your patience was weakness. They started believing your kindness was permission. They started believing your availability was guaranteed. And then one day you stopped. No dramatic announcement, no speech, no warning. You simply started moving differently. You stopped arguing with people committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped giving long explanations to people who had already decided what they wanted to believe. You stopped chasing conversations that only existed to drain you. You stopped proving your intentions to people who benefited from questioning them. And that's when everything became interesting, because people who were comfortable with your old behavior suddenly became uncomfortable with your new boundaries. They didn't ask, "Are you happier?" They asked, "What's wrong with you?" They didn't ask, "What made you stronger?" They asked, "Why are you acting like this?" They weren't studying your growth. They were studying the disappearance of their access. That's the difference. You have to understand something about control. It doesn't always look like someone standing over you and giving orders. Sometimes control sounds like guilt. Sometimes it sounds like disappointment. Sometimes it sounds like, "After everything I've done for you." Sometimes it sounds like, "I thought you were better than this." Sometimes it comes disguised as concern. Sometimes it arrives wearing the face of someone who claims they only want what's best for you. And if you've spent years needing approval, those little sentences can control your entire life. You change your decision because someone is disappointed. You abandon your plan because someone laughs at it. You silence your opinion because someone calls you selfish. You stay in places that make you miserable because leaving makes somebody uncomfortable. That's not freedom. That's obedience with better vocabulary. Then something inside you finally clicks. You realize that every time you say yes while your entire body is screaming no, you're teaching people that your boundaries don't matter. Every time you tolerate disrespect to avoid conflict, you're teaching people that disrespect has no consequences. Every time you betray yourself just to keep someone else happy, you're slowly becoming a stranger to yourself. And eventually you get tired. Not angry, not dramatic, just tired. Tired of explaining, tired of performing, tired of being the version of yourself that makes everybody else comfortable while you quietly disappear. So you become harder to control, not cruel, not heartless, not arrogant, just conscious. You start thinking before responding. You stop reacting emotionally to every little provocation. You don't give everyone immediate access to your attention. You don't reveal every plan while it's still fragile. You don't tell everyone what you're building. You don't need an audience for every decision. You start understanding that privacy isn't secrecy. Silence isn't weakness. Boundaries aren't hatred, and independence isn't disrespect. That's when certain people start behaving strangely. They test you. They say something that used to trigger you just to see if it still works. They create little conflicts to pull you back into the old dynamic. They remind you of who you used to be. They bring up your mistakes because they want you standing in the same psychological position you occupied years ago. They want the old you back because the old you was easier to predict. Easier to guilt, easier to pressure, easier to manipulate. But now they press the button and nothing happens. They throw the bait and you don't bite. They expect an argument and you give them silence. They expect an explanation and you give them a decision. They expect you to chase them and you keep walking. And that is where their frustration begins. Not because you hurt them, but because their influence over you isn't automatic anymore. They can still speak. They can still criticize, they can still disagree, they can still walk away. But they can't reach inside your mind and rearrange your decisions just because they're uncomfortable. You finally understand that someone being upset with your boundary doesn't automatically mean your boundary is wrong. Someone misunderstanding your choice doesn't automatically make your choice foolish. Someone losing access to you doesn't mean you've become a bad person. Sometimes it simply means the relationship depended more on your compliance than you ever realized. And the funniest part is that you don't even need to announce the transformation. You don't need to stand in front of everybody and say, "Look at me, I've changed." Let them notice. Let them wonder. Let them misunderstand. Let them call you distant. Let them say you've become cold. Let them create their little theories about why you're not available like before. You don't have to correct every story people tell about you. Some people only understand you when you're giving them something, and when you stop giving it, they suddenly claim they never understood you at all. That's fine. Let them have their version. You have work to do, because the real power isn't making people afraid of you. It's becoming so grounded in yourself that their approval stops deciding your behavior. You don't need to dominate anybody. You don't need revenge. You don't need to prove that they were wrong. You just need to stop handing people the remote control to your emotions, your time, your attention, your confidence, your future. Once you understand that, you start seeing the entire game differently. You realize some people weren't supporting you, they were managing you. Some weren't protecting you, they were limiting you. Some weren't asking for your honesty, they were demanding information they could later use against you. And once you recognize the difference, you stop begging to be understood by people who were perfectly comfortable misunderstanding you when it benefited them. You stop returning to the cage simply because the cage has familiar walls. You stop shrinking just because somebody preferred the smaller version of you. You stop confusing their discomfort with your responsibility. And you start walking forward without explaining every step, every decision, every boundary, every silence, every change that finally made you harder to control. There comes a point where you realize you've been explaining yourself to people who were never actually trying to understand you. That's when things get interesting, because you spent years thinking communication would solve everything. You thought if you explained your intentions clearly enough, gave enough details, showed enough proof, Maybe people would finally see your side. So you explained why you couldn't come. You explained why you needed space. You explained why you made that decision. You explained why you didn't answer immediately. You explained why you were tired. You explained why you said no. You explained why you walked away. And somehow, no matter how carefully you explained, there was always another question, another accusation, another little interrogation waiting for you. Eventually you realize something uncomfortable. Some people don't ask questions because they want answers. They ask questions because they want control. That's when you stop playing the game. Not because you've become heartless, but because you've finally noticed the pattern. You realize that every explanation gives someone another piece of information to debate. You say, I can't do this because of this reason, and suddenly they're arguing with the reason. You say, I need time for myself, and suddenly they're asking why they weren't included. You say, that doesn't work for me, and suddenly you're being asked to defend what does work for you. You keep answering, they keep questioning, and somehow you're standing there defending a decision that never required their permission in the first place. It's almost funny when you see it clearly. You weren't having a conversation. You were attending your own trial. And the moment you stop explaining, people who were used to having access to your reasoning start feeling uncomfortable. They can't see what's happening inside your head anymore. They don't know what you're planning. They don't know what you're thinking. They don't know whether you're upset, focused, tired, busy, or simply uninterested in participating. And because they don't know, they start guessing. That's where the accusations begin. You've changed. You're acting weird. You think you're better than everyone. You're becoming selfish. Amazing how quickly independence gets renamed arrogance when someone loses access to you. But you don't need to defend yourself against every interpretation. That's one of the most exhausting mistakes people make. They think they have to correct every misunderstanding. They think every rumor needs a response. Every criticism needs an explanation. Every accusation deserves a paragraph. No. Sometimes the strongest answer is no answer at all, not because you're afraid to speak, but because you've learned that not every person deserves access to your mental energy. Some conversations don't produce understanding. They produce exhaustion. Some people aren't looking for clarity. They're looking for a weakness they can grab onto. Think about how much power you give away when you feel obligated to explain every move. You tell people where you're going, why you're going, who you're meeting, what you're doing, why you changed your mind, why you don't agree, why you don't want to participate. Before you know it, your life becomes a public meeting where everyone gets a vote. And then you wonder why you feel trapped. You created a democracy around decisions that were supposed to belong to you. You don't owe everyone a detailed explanation for protecting your peace. You don't owe everyone a complete report on your priorities. You don't owe someone an essay because you declined an invitation. You don't owe an emotional autobiography because you became less available. And you definitely don't owe anyone a justification for becoming more disciplined. If you're building something, protect it. If you're changing, protect the process. If you're healing from old habits, don't keep inviting people into the room just so they can judge the renovation. The strange thing is, once you stop explaining yourself, you become more aware of your own decisions. Before, you might have made choices based on how they would look to other people. Now you ask yourself a different question. Does this make sense for me? That's a dangerous question when you've spent years living for approval. Because once you start trusting your own judgment, manipulation becomes harder. Guilt doesn't work as easily. Pressure doesn't work as easily. Emotional reactions don't control you as easily. You begin separating what you actually want from what you were trained to want. And some people will test the new version of you. They'll push harder because the old tricks aren't working. They'll say, "What's gotten into you?" They'll remind you how you used to behave. They'll compare the present you to the version that was easier to control. And you might feel tempted to explain yourself one more time just to make everything comfortable. Don't. You don't have to convince someone that your boundary is legitimate before you enforce it. You don't need their agreement to make a decision. Their confusion doesn't cancel your clarity. Silence can be uncomfortable because silence removes the script. When you explain everything, people know what to attack. When you remain calm and say less, they have to deal with their own assumptions. That's why some people become desperate for a reaction. They provoke you because your reaction reassures them that they still have influence. They want the old argument. They want the old emotional explosion. They want you defending yourself for 3 hours while they sit there feeling powerful, because they managed to pull you back into the same cycle. But imagine refusing to participate. Imagine hearing the accusation and simply thinking, that's what you believe. Imagine someone demanding an explanation and realizing you can answer with one sentence. Imagine walking away from a conversation without needing the other person to admit you were right. That's maturity. That's control over yourself. And ironically, the moment you stop trying to control how people perceive you, you become much harder for them to control. You don't have to become mysterious for attention. You don't have to pretend you don't care. You don't have to turn silence into a performance. Just become selective. Speak when your words matter. Explain when explanation creates understanding. Stay silent when explanation becomes an invitation for manipulation. Let your actions carry the weight your words used to carry. Let consistency answer questions you don't feel like answering. Let time expose what arguments never could. Because eventually people either adjust to the new boundaries or remove themselves from your life. And either way you learn something valuable. The people who genuinely respect you won't need unlimited access to your thoughts to respect your decisions, while the people who depended on your explanations to maintain influence will keep asking for more reasons, more details, more proof, more access, more chances to turn your own words against you, until you finally realize you can leave the entire courtroom without waiting for the judge, the jury, or the spectators to agree with your decision. You know what's strange? People can claim they love you, support you, respect you, and believe in you, right up until you stop doing what makes their life easier. That's when the performance gets interesting. You say no once, and suddenly you're selfish. You ask for respect, and suddenly you're too sensitive. You stop answering every message immediately, and suddenly you've become distant. You refuse to tolerate the same disrespect you used to tolerate, and suddenly everybody has a diagnosis for your personality. Funny how quickly your character becomes questionable when your obedience disappears. Some people weren't attached to you as much as they were attached to your compliance. They liked the version of you that didn't make things difficult. The version that said yes. The version that stayed quiet. The version that apologized first. The version that carried everybody else's emotional baggage while pretending it wasn't heavy. And when you finally put that baggage down, they don't celebrate your freedom. They complain that you're no longer carrying theirs. That's what boundaries reveal. They don't create people's behavior, they expose it. A healthy person hears your boundary and thinks, okay, I understand. Maybe they don't love it, maybe they disagree with it, but they respect it. Someone who benefited from having no boundaries reacts differently. They negotiate. They guilt trip you. They become angry. They remind you of everything they've done for you. They act wounded because you dared to make a decision without consulting them. Suddenly your simple no becomes a personal attack. That's when you need to pay attention, because the reaction tells you more than the words ever did. If someone only treats you well when you're easy to control, then what they loved wasn't your freedom. They loved your usefulness. And maybe you've spent years confusing being needed with being valued. That's a dangerous mistake. Being needed can feel powerful because people constantly come to you, ask for favors, demand your attention, depend on your emotional energy. You start thinking, they need me, so I must matter. But sometimes you're not being valued. You're being used efficiently. You're the person everybody calls when they need something, the person who always forgives, always fixes, always listens, always gives another chance. Then the moment you need something, suddenly everyone is busy. Interesting system, isn't it? You're essential when you're serving them and difficult when you're serving yourself. Your boundaries interrupt that system. They force people to interact with you as a person rather than a resource. And some people don't know how to do that. They were comfortable with unlimited access, unlimited time, unlimited forgiveness, unlimited explanations, unlimited chances. So when you put a limit on anything, they feel deprived. Not because you harmed them, but because the arrangement changed. And they may try to convince you that the old arrangement was your responsibility. They'll say you're not the same. Good. You're not supposed to be. Growth would be pointless if you stayed identical just to protect somebody else's comfort. A boundary isn't you saying, you can't do anything. It's you saying, if this happens, here's what I will do. That's a completely different kind of power. You don't need to control another person. You control your participation. If someone insults you, you can leave the conversation. If someone repeatedly disrespects your time, you can stop making yourself available. If someone constantly drains your energy, you can create distance. You don't need to threaten them. You don't need to punish them. You simply remove yourself from the pattern, and suddenly the person who thought they controlled the situation discovers that they never controlled you at all. They only controlled you while you agreed to participate. That's why boundaries can make certain people angry. They remove the argument. They remove the endless negotiation. They remove the possibility of wearing you down until you surrender. Because before, maybe they knew if they pushed long enough, you would eventually say yes just to make the conversation stop. Now they push, and nothing happens. They complain, and nothing happens. They become emotional, and still nothing happens. You stay calm, you stay clear, you don't turn cruel, you don't become loud, you simply don't move. And that's the part that feels strange when you're learning this for the first time. You may feel guilty. You may wonder whether you're being too harsh. You may feel uncomfortable because you're finally doing something you've never done before, choosing yourself without asking everyone else if they're okay with it. That discomfort doesn't necessarily mean you're doing something wrong. Sometimes discomfort is just the sound of an old habit losing control over you. You're used to keeping everybody happy. Now you're learning that keeping everybody happy is impossible, and trying to do it can cost you your entire identity. Let people misunderstand the boundary if they need to. Let them call you cold. Let them say you've changed. Let them complain that you're not as available as before. You don't have to prove that you're still a good person by becoming available for disrespect again. You can care about someone and still limit their access to you. You can love someone and still refuse their manipulation. You can forgive someone and still decide that they don't get the same position in your life anymore. Forgiveness doesn't require unlimited access. Kindness doesn't require self-abandonment. And respect isn't something you owe to people who repeatedly refuse to give it back. Eventually, the people who genuinely care about you will adjust. They might need time, but they will learn where the line is. The people who only loved your obedience will keep trying to erase it. They'll keep testing it, questioning it, mocking it, or pretending it doesn't exist. And every test gives you information. Every reaction reveals something. Every attempt to pull you back into the old version of yourself shows you exactly why you needed to leave that version behind. Because the moment you stop being convenient, people finally show you whether they wanted you, or simply wanted what they could get from you while you were too afraid to say no, too afraid to disappoint them, too afraid to walk away, too afraid to become the person who no longer needs permission to protect their own peace, time, attention, standards, and life. There is something deeply uncomfortable about a person no longer reacts the way you expect. Not loud, not dramatic, not desperate to prove anything, just quiet. Because when people know exactly what makes you angry, what makes you insecure, what makes you chase them, what makes you apologize, and what makes you fold, they can predict you. And predictable people are easy to influence. You don't even have to threaten them. You just know which button to press. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's rejection. Maybe it's silence. Maybe it's criticism. Maybe it's the fear of being misunderstood. Push the right button, and suddenly they abandon their own decision just to restore somebody else's comfort. But then one day the button stops working. You hear the insult and don't react. You hear the criticism and don't defend yourself for 30 minutes. Someone ignores you and you don't chase them. Someone tries to make you jealous and you don't compete. Someone expects you to explode, and you simply look at the situation for what it is. That's when people start wondering what happened to you. And honestly, nothing happened to you. You just stopped giving your emotions away for free. You became quieter because you learned that every reaction doesn't deserve a performance. Before, maybe you felt like you had to answer everything immediately. Somebody said something disrespectful, you responded. Somebody questioned your character, you defended it. Somebody misunderstood you, you rushed to correct them. Somebody pulled away, you chased them. Somebody criticized your choices, you explained yourself. Your entire day could be controlled by whatever somebody else decided to throw at you. That's exhausting. And eventually you realize the world doesn't need access to your nervous system. Not every comment deserves your attention. Not every accusation deserves your defense. Not every person deserves a front row seat to your emotions. So you started observing instead of reacting. And observation changes everything. When you stop reacting immediately, you begin seeing patterns. You notice who only calls when they need something. You notice who compliments you when you're useful and criticizes you when you're independent. You notice who creates drama whenever you become unavailable. You notice who suddenly becomes interested when you're succeeding. You notice who respects your boundaries and who treats your boundaries like a challenge. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. That's the dangerous part about awareness. You can pretend you didn't notice, but you can't honestly go back to being blind. Your silence also makes people reveal themselves. When you stop filling every empty space with explanations, other people start filling it with assumptions. Let them. You don't have to rush in and manage every interpretation. If someone wants to believe you're arrogant because you stopped chasing approval, that's their story. If someone thinks you're distant because you stopped answering every pointless conversation, that's their interpretation. If someone calls you selfish because you finally started protecting your time, that's their discomfort speaking. You don't need to correct every misunderstanding. Sometimes the need to constantly control how people perceive you is just another form of dependence. And suddenly you're unpredictable, not because you're playing games, but because you stop being emotionally programmable. They don't know whether you'll argue, laugh, walk away, forgive, ignore, or simply move on. More importantly, you don't even need to decide based on what they expect. You decide based on what the situation deserves. That's maturity. The old version of you reacted from habit. The new version of you responds from choice. There is a massive difference between those two things. One is automatic. The other is freedom. Some people will test this freedom. Of course they will. They remember the old version of you. They remember how quickly you reacted. They remember how easy it was to pull you into an argument. They remember that if they ignored you long enough, you would eventually reach out. They remember that if they accused you of being selfish, you would start explaining yourself. They remember that if they questioned your loyalty, you would start proving it. So they try the same tricks again, same words, same attitude, same little games. And then they discover something irritating. You're not there anymore. You might hear something designed to provoke you and think, that's cute. Not because you're trying to be superior, but because you've finally recognized the mechanism. Someone is trying to create an emotional reaction so they can control what happens next. Once you see that, the trick loses some of its magic. You don't have to win the argument. You don't have to expose them. You don't have to deliver the perfect comeback. You can simply refuse to participate. That's what makes emotional control so powerful. You aren't controlling them. You're controlling yourself. And control over yourself is something people often underestimate. Anyone can become angry. Anyone can send the message they regret 5 minutes later. Anyone can say something cruel when they're hurt. Anyone can make a decision in the heat of the moment. But being able to pause, being able to sit with discomfort without immediately escaping it, being able to let someone misunderstand you without desperately correcting them, being able to walk away without demanding the last word, that's different. That's strength without the costume. You also stopped announcing everything. You don't tell everybody your next move. You don't broadcast every goal while it's still fragile. You don't need to post every improvement so people can clap for it. You don't need to explain every change in your lifestyle. You're building quietly because you've learned that attention can become interference. Some people don't need to know what you're doing until you've done it. Not because you're hiding, because you're protecting your focus. There's a difference between secrecy and privacy, and you finally learned the difference. The funny thing is, once you become comfortable with silence, you stop fearing other people's reactions. You stop thinking you need to make every person comfortable with your decisions. You stop measuring your growth by how many people approve of it. And that makes you difficult to manipulate. Guilt becomes less effective. Pressure becomes less effective. Provocation becomes less effective. Fear of rejection becomes less effective, because you finally understand that losing someone's approval isn't the same thing as losing yourself. Sometimes the real loss was spending years trying to keep people who only liked you when you were easy to control. So let them wonder why you're quieter. Let them notice that you don't argue like you used to. Let them realize their usual tactics aren't producing the same reaction. Let them call you different. You are different. You're not trying to become colder. You're becoming clearer. You're not trying to make people nervous. You're becoming less dependent on their approval. You're not trying to punish anyone. You're simply refusing to punish yourself just because somebody else is uncomfortable with your boundaries. And when someone realizes they can no longer control your mood, your attention, your decisions, your confidence, or your direction with a few carefully chosen words, that's when they start searching for the old version of you, the version that reacted on command, explained on command, apologized on command, chased on command, and bent whenever somebody applied enough pressure, while you stand there quietly realizing that the most powerful thing you changed was not your personality, your voice, or your attitude, but the amount of access other people were allowed to have to your mind, your emotions, your time, and your next move. You know what's funny? The moment you stop allowing people to use your kindness as a shortcut, they start calling you cold. You could spend years being available, forgiving, understanding, patient, and generous, and nobody questions it while they're benefiting from it. You answer when they call. You listen when they need someone. You help when they create problems for themselves. You give chances after they've already wasted the previous ones. You stay quiet when they disrespect you because you don't want unnecessary conflict. You keep making excuses for people because you understand their struggles. And then one day you get tired. You don't become cruel. You simply stop volunteering for situations that repeatedly drain you. Suddenly you're cold. Interesting, isn't it? Apparently kindness is only kindness when it comes with unlimited access. Some people don't actually appreciate your generosity. They become comfortable with it. That's a dangerous difference. Appreciation says, thank you. Entitlement says, you should have done more. Appreciation notices your effort. Entitlement notices what you didn't provide. And when you start pulling your energy back, entitlement gets offended. They don't ask why you're exhausted. They ask why you're unavailable. They don't wonder whether they took too much. They wonder why you finally stopped giving. That's when you discover that some relationships were balanced only because you were carrying the weight for two people. Maybe you were the one who always initiated the conversation, always checked in, always forgave first, always gave another chance, always showed up. You called it loyalty. They called it normal. You thought you were proving that you cared. They started expecting it. That's how unhealthy patterns become invisible. Nobody announces the moment a boundary disappears. It happens gradually. One favor becomes 10. One apology becomes a habit. One exception becomes the standard. You keep saying it's okay until people stop believing they ever need to ask whether it's okay. Then you change the rules, not for revenge, not to punish them. You simply stop participating in the old arrangement. You don't answer every message immediately. You don't fix every problem. You don't keep rescuing people from consequences they created themselves. You don't lend your peace to someone else's chaos, and suddenly they accuse you of becoming selfish. But selfishness and self-respect are not the same thing. Selfishness says, only I matter. Self-respect says, I matter too. That's a distinction people conveniently forget when your attention used to be unlimited. The hardest part is that you might actually feel guilty at first. That's because you've trained yourself to measure your goodness by how much you sacrifice. You think being a good person means never disappointing anyone. It doesn't. You can be a good person and still say no. You can care about someone and still refuse to solve their problems. You can forgive someone and still keep your distance. You can understand someone's pain without volunteering to become the place where they dump it. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction dressed up as virtue. And some people will test your new limits. They'll ask for one more favor. They'll make one more emotional appeal. They'll remind you of the old days. They'll say, "You weren't like this before." Exactly, you weren't like this before. You were easier to access. You were easier to pressure. You were more afraid of disappointing people. You thought saying no made you a bad person. Now you understand that constantly saying yes to others can mean constantly saying no to yourself. You don't have to become rude to become unavailable. That's another trick people play. They make you think the only alternative to being endlessly generous is becoming heartless. No, you can be respectful and still have limits. You can speak calmly and still mean no. You can walk away without insulting anyone. You can stop answering without creating a dramatic announcement. You can protect your time without explaining every minute of your schedule. You can become selective without becoming cruel. The truth is, people who genuinely respect you won't need you to destroy yourself to prove that you care. They'll notice when you're tired. They'll understand when you need space. They'll respect your decisions even when they don't benefit from them. But the people who were comfortable using your kindness will often treat your boundaries like betrayal. They may accuse you of changing, becoming distant, becoming selfish, becoming cold. Let them. Sometimes being called cold simply means you stop providing warmth to people who kept bringing you ice. And that's the strange beauty of growing up. You stop trying to convince everyone that you're a good person. You start behaving according to your values whether anyone applauds or not. You stop keeping score of how much you give. You stop expecting gratitude from people who never learned how to appreciate it. You stop chasing people who only remember your value when they need something. Your energy becomes precious because you finally understand that time doesn't come back. Attention doesn't come back. Peace doesn't come back. And every hour spent managing someone else's chaos is an hour you can't spend building your own life. So if they say you've become cold, maybe don't rush to prove them wrong. Ask yourself what changed. Maybe you stopped answering every call. Maybe you stopped tolerating disrespect. Maybe you stopped rescuing people from consequences. Maybe you stopped letting guilt make your decisions. Maybe you finally realized that being useful to everyone isn't the same as being loved by everyone. Maybe you're simply learning that kindness should be a choice, not a weakness people can exploit whenever they feel like it. And when they discover that your generosity now comes with standards, your attention comes with limits, your forgiveness comes with wisdom, and your presence is no longer guaranteed just because they expect it, they may call you cold, selfish, distant, difficult, or changed, while you quietly become someone who finally understands that protecting your energy isn't cruelty. It's refusing to keep handing pieces of yourself to people who only notice your value when you stop giving them everything. There comes a point where you stop asking people if they're okay with the person you're becoming. Not because you stopped caring about people, but because you finally realized you can't build a life while constantly waiting for permission to live it. For years, maybe you checked the room before making a decision. You watched people's faces. You listened to their opinions. You wondered what they would say if you changed your habits, your goals, your friends, your priorities, your appearance, your schedule, your entire direction. You weren't necessarily weak. You were trained to seek approval. And approval can become a very quiet prison because nobody has to lock the door when you've learned to ask everyone else whether you're allowed to leave. The funny thing is, people rarely say, "Don't grow." They say something much softer. "Are you sure? Why are you doing that? You used to be different. Do you really think that's going to work? What will people think?" Sounds harmless, doesn't it? Sometimes it is genuine concern. But sometimes those little questions are enough to make you doubt yourself. You start second-guessing decisions you were confident about 5 minutes ago. You start shrinking your plans so they don't make other people uncomfortable. You start hiding your ambition because someone might call you unrealistic. You start pretending you don't care because caring too much might make you look foolish. And slowly, without even noticing, you begin living according to the comfort level of people who aren't responsible for your future. Then something changes. You realize their opinion is not a steering wheel. It's just information. You can hear it without obeying it. You can respect someone without surrendering your judgment to them. You can listen without becoming controlled. That's a completely different mindset. Approval becomes optional instead of necessary. And once that happens, you move differently. You stop announcing every goal because you don't need applause before you've earned the result. You stop asking everybody whether your idea is good. You stop looking for 10 people to validate one decision. You start trusting your ability to make mistakes and recover. That's real confidence. Confidence isn't believing you'll never be wrong. It's knowing that even if you're wrong, you'll survive the lesson. You don't need everybody to guarantee the outcome before you take the first step. Some people won't understand that. They might prefer the version of you that needed their opinion. They might have enjoyed feeling important because every decision passed through them. They might have been comfortable when you constantly asked, "What do you think?" And now you're making choices without waiting for the committee meeting. Suddenly you're arrogant. Suddenly you're stubborn. Suddenly you've changed. Yes, you changed the relationship between their opinion and your decisions. That's all. And don't confuse independence with isolation. You still need good people. You still need honest advice. You still need friends who can challenge you. The difference is that you choose whose voice deserves weight. Not everybody gets equal access to your mind. Why would they? You wouldn't hand your finances to someone who knows nothing about money, so why hand your future to someone who knows nothing about your goals, values, sacrifices, or circumstances? Advice only becomes useful when it comes from a place of understanding, not control. The new you learns to ask better questions. Not, will they approve? But, is this right for me? Not, will they understand? But, do I understand why I'm doing this? Not, what if they judge me? But, what happens if I keep living for their judgment? Those questions change the entire game. Because once you start measuring decisions against your values instead of other people's reactions, you become harder to manipulate. You might lose some people along the way. That's uncomfortable. But not every relationship is designed to survive your growth. Some relationships are built around a specific version of you. When that version disappears, the relationship has nothing to stand on. It hurts, but pretending to remain the same just to keep someone is more expensive. You can miss someone and still know you shouldn't return. You can love someone and still understand that your paths are different. You can appreciate the past without allowing it to control your future. And the approval you once chased starts looking strangely small. You remember all the times you changed your plans because somebody didn't like them. All the times you stayed quiet because you didn't want criticism. All the times you abandoned an opportunity because somebody laughed. All the times you said, maybe you're right, when deep down you knew you were simply afraid. Fear dressed itself up as practicality. Insecurity dressed itself up as humility. People-pleasing dressed itself up as kindness. And now you're taking the costume off. You don't need to become loud about it. In fact, the quieter you become, the stronger it gets. You don't need to tell everyone that you don't care what they think. People who genuinely don't need approval rarely make speeches about it. They just move. They work. They learn. They adjust. They make mistakes. They keep going. They don't stop every 5 minutes to check whether somebody is impressed. That's the real shift. You stop performing your life and start living it. You stop trying to make every decision look reasonable to everyone else. You stop wasting energy convincing people that your path makes sense. Some people will understand later. Some never will. Neither outcome needs to stop you. Your responsibility isn't to make your life understandable to everyone. Your responsibility is to make it meaningful to you. And when criticism comes, you learn to separate useful feedback from emotional noise. If someone points out a genuine mistake, you listen. You correct it. You grow. If someone simply dislikes your progress because it makes them uncomfortable, you don't have to absorb that discomfort. That's emotional maturity. Not blindly ignoring everyone, but refusing to let every opinion become an instruction. Eventually, you become comfortable with being misunderstood. That's a strange kind of freedom. Someone can think you're making the wrong choice, and you can still make it. Someone can doubt you, and you can still work. Someone can laugh, and you can still continue. Someone can leave, and you can still build. Someone can refuse to understand your transformation, and you can still become the person you were trying to become. Because the new you has finally learned something the old you didn't understand. Approval feels good, but it doesn't build your future. Compliments feel good, but they don't do the work. Validation feels good, but it can't make the decision for you. At some point, you have to stop looking around the room for permission and look at the road in front of you. You have to decide what matters. You have to accept that some people will disagree. You have to accept that some people will judge. You have to accept that growth will sometimes make you unpopular. And you have to keep moving anyway. Because the moment your direction depends on everybody else's approval, your life stops being yours and becomes a performance designed to keep other people comfortable, while the real version of you waits quietly underneath all that hesitation, all those explanations, all those permission slips, all those imaginary judges you carried inside your head, waiting for the day you finally stop asking whether you're allowed to become who you were capable of becoming, and simply take another step